Hey everybody, let's talk about some nutrition. So when we're talking about nutrition, we're talking about the nutrients in foods and also their actions within the body. And we can divide the nutrients that we need into health into 5 different categories. So let's go through these pictures here and see if we can identify these 5 different categories of nutrients. What about this loaf of bread? What nutrient comes to mind with this loaf of bread? What about carbohydrates? Carbohydrates are a category of nutrients, and there's a lot of carbohydrates found in bread. What about these steaks? And there's not a lot of fat in these steaks. These are pretty lean, not a lot of marbling. So what nutrient comes to mind with these steaks? How about protein? Protein is a category of nutrients, and there's a lot of protein in steak. What about this stick of butter? Well, butter falls into a category of nutrients called lipids, and there's 2 types of lipids. There's saturated fats and unsaturated fats, and butter is categorized as a saturated fat. What about these oranges? What nutrient comes to mind, or what comes to mind nutritionally when you think about these oranges? Well, when I see oranges or any citrus fruit, I think of vitamin C. And so another category of nutrients are vitamins. And lastly, what about this carton of milk? When I see milk, I think of calcium, and calcium falls under a category of nutrients called minerals. And so the 5 nutrients that we need are carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, vitamins, and minerals. Now we can categorize these 5 nutrients as either macronutrients or micronutrients. And macronutrients are those nutrients that are required by the body in relatively large amounts, okay, in grams worth. Something you can see with the naked eye, maybe a handful worth of nutrients. And the other category are micronutrients. And these are nutrients that we need in really small amounts. Micrograms, milligrams, just trace amounts, maybe little flecks of dust worth. So let's go through and see if we can categorize each of these as macronutrients or micronutrients. So first of all, which of these are categorized as macronutrients? Which of these do we need in relatively large amounts? With regards to macronutrients, we have carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids are all macronutrients. These are nutrients that we need in relatively large amounts. Which means with regards to micronutrients that vitamins and minerals are classified as micronutrients. These are nutrients we need in just really small amounts. And it's important to note that receiving proper nutrition, receiving all of these nutrients that we just talked about and in the appropriate amounts is critical for health. It's critical for growth, mental and physical development, and overall functioning of the body. Now, the improper consumption of nutrients results in something called malnutrition. Mal meaning bad. And this can have serious health effects. And we can categorize malnutrition. We can have either undernutrition or we can have overnutrition. And when we're talking about undernutrition, we're talking about a lack of total calories. And so you're not ingesting enough calories to meet the energy needs of the body. So that's one type of undernutrition. The other type of undernutrition is if you have a specific nutrient deficiency. So maybe your calorie intake is okay, but there's a specific nutrient that you're not getting in the right amounts. And the problem with either of these is that the body lacks the resources it needs to perform its functions, either with the lack of total calories or a specific nutrient deficiency. And let's look at a couple examples of undernutrition. The children in this photo have a condition called hypoproteinemia. Now, what does that mean? What does hypo refer to? Hypo means low. Protein refers to protein. And emia refers to levels in the blood. So hypoproteinemia means there's low levels of protein in the blood. And in this instance, this is due to a lack of dietary proteins. They're just not getting enough protein in the diet. And the symptoms of this include edema, swelling of the tissues, and the accumulation of fluid in the abdominal cavity. But the problem here is that the body just doesn't have the proteins it needs to do its functions. There's a lot of structures in the body made of proteins. Enzymes, antibodies, hormones, skeletal muscles are all made of proteins. And if you don't have those in the diet, then that's a problem for the functioning of the body. Here's another example of undernutrition, and this is another example of a specific nutrient deficiency, and this represents an iron deficiency. Iron's a mineral. And if you have an iron deficiency, that can result in the condition called anemia, which means you have a low red blood cell count or you have a low hemoglobin count. And the reason that's the case is because iron is a critical component of hemoglobin, which you find within red blood cells. And it's that iron in the hemoglobin that's responsible for binding oxygen. And so if you don't have enough iron in the diet, either you're not making enough hemoglobin or perhaps the red blood cells aren't being made correctly. And so the result is low hemoglobin or a low red blood cell count. And the problem with both of these cases is that you have a low oxygen carrying capacity. You're not able to deliver the oxygen through the blood to the cells as they need it. And then the converse of undernutrition is overnutrition. And overnutrition deals with an excess of calories. And the problem with an excess of calories is that it can lead to obesity. It can lead to obesity, and it can also lead to type 2 diabetes. And the problem with both of these is that they're linked to cardiovascular disease. With obesity and the accumulation of fat is a highly vascular tissue. It requires miles and miles of blood vessels. And so when you accumulate fat in the body, the heart has to work a lot harder to pump blood through all those additional miles of blood vessels. And that puts strain on the heart and can cause cardiovascular disease. And the problem with type 2 diabetes is categorized by hyperglycemia, high levels of sugar in the blood. And that sugar can damage the inner lining of the blood vessels and again result in hardening of the arteries, atherosclerosis, and cardiovascular disease. Now, out of all the times to receive proper nutrition, it's especially critical during the first 1,000 days of life. And this includes the time in utero. So about 270 days in utero through a little past age 2. This is especially critical time because if you have undernutrition during this time, then it can result in what's called stunting. And stunting refers to improper growth and development, both physical and mental development. And this can be both serious and permanent. With regards to physical development, this is a picture from some kids in Tanzania, and this is the median height of 9-year-olds worldwide. And more than 40% of all kids in Tanzania, which is an African country, did not meet that median height due to improper nutrition during these first 1,000 days of life. But probably most tragically is the effects that it has on mental development. So lack of proper nutrition during this first 1,000 days keeps the brain from developing properly. And what that means is that malnourished children are less able to learn. Okay, the neuronal connections are compromised, and they're less able to learn throughout life, which has, repercussions all throughout life, including getting a job, upward mobility, all that type of stuff. And that's seen in this picture down here. Let's take a zoom up on it. And these are neurons in the brain. Here we have some cell bodies. These are the axons. And then you have all this branching that comes off the cell bodies, and these are dendrites. And dendrites are the part of the neuron that receive communication from other neurons. And so it's critical when neurons communicate that you have these dendrites that they're able to connect through. They're able to communicate through. And so that's a normal brain. And then this is the brain from a child that's been stunted. And you can see here the cell bodies are there and the axons, but the dendrites are missing. Okay, there's just not as many dendrites as in a child that had proper nutrition. And so that means that the neurons aren't able to communicate as efficiently, and you're not getting those neural connections in the brain. Tragic and preventable. And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is putting a lot of effort into combating these problems. So the first nutrient we're going to talk about are carbohydrates. And from a structural perspective, carbohydrates are what we call polymers. They're structures made up of many individual units. Poly means many, and mer means units. So you can look at this necklace here and think about this as the generic structure of a polymer. The entire thing is a polymer, but it's made up of many individual units. The individual beads are the individual units. But with carbohydrates, we can be a little more specific. Not only are they polymers, but specifically, they are polysaccharides. They're molecules made up of many individual sugars. Saccharide refers to sugars. And so this necklace can represent the structure of a polysaccharide. The entire thing is a polysaccharide, but the polysaccharide is made up of many individual sugars. Each one of these beads is an individual sugar. And we call those individual sugars monosaccharides. These are some common monosaccharides that we find in the diet. We have glucose, fructose, and galactose. Now, what do these all have common with regards to their name? They all have the suffix "-ose, and whenever you see that suffix "-ose, that means that we're referring to a sugar. Something else that they have in common, and that all carbohydrates have in common, is that they're made from carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. And so commonly I'll abbreviate carbohydrates as CHOs because they're made of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. But out of these three dietary monosaccharides, glucose is by far the most important to human physiology. And so we're going to spend our time talking about glucose. So why is glucose so important? Well, glucose is so important because it's the main metabolic fuel of the body. It's the primary fuel that the cells of the body are going to use to generate ATP. And let's take a look at that in this diagram below. So the metabolic events that take nutrients and convert them to ATP are called cellular respiration. And this is representing the different steps of cellular respiration. We have glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and also the electron transport chain. And what this diagram is showing, here we have some peanuts, and peanuts have all three of the macronutrients in it. They have carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And one of the things that this diagram is showing is that all three of these nutrients can enter different parts of the cellular respiration cycle and be used to generate ATP. But out of all of these, carbohydrates, and specifically glucose, is going to be by far the most common source, the most relied upon source of energy in order to generate ATP. And that's especially true for the brain. So the brain is highly glucose dependent, is another reason glucose is so important. In general, the mammalian brain has a huge energy demand. All those action potentials firing, all those billions of neurons communicating with each other constantly, that takes a lot of energy. And so the brain has a huge energy demand, and it uses glucose as its main source of energy. And this is why, one of the reasons why normal blood sugar levels are so important. So blood sugar is something we maintain homeostasis over. Okay, we want to keep blood sugar levels within a specific range at all times. And that's because we want the brain to have continuous access to glucose. And so the brain takes in that glucose, it goes through cellular respiration, and it converts that to ATP. And you'll know it if your blood sugar is low, because it affects the central nervous system, it affects the brain. If your blood sugar levels are low and the brain isn't getting enough glucose, generating enough ATP, then you feel the effects of that. Maybe it affects your mood. Maybe you'll get a little bit dizzy. Those are all central nervous system things. Now, in a normal, healthy diet, our primary source of carbohydrates is from a molecule called starch. And starch is a polysaccharide, and it consists entirely of glucose. So this is a model of what starch looks like right here. It's a polysaccharide. It's made up of many individual units, and these individual units that I'm circling here are all individual monosaccharides, and specifically, they're all glucose. And another thing about starch is that it's considered moderately branched. So you can see that there is some branching to it. It's considered moderately branched. And like I said, in a normal, healthy diet, this is where our primary source of carbohydrates comes from. So where do we find starch? Starch is found in plants, and specifically, starch is how plants store excess glucose. It's how they store energy. So let's go through that process a little bit. So what's special about plants is that they are able to take carbon dioxide and water, and in the presence of sunlight, they're able to convert that into glucose. They're able to make their own glucose out of carbon dioxide and water in the presence of sunlight. And plant cells use that glucose just like we do. It goes through cellular respiration, it generates ATP, and then that ATP is used by the cells to do work. But what if the plant has excess glucose? Okay, it's not something you want to get rid of, and so the plant can store it as glucose or store it as starch. So here we have a potato plant, and it's generating all this glucose, and any extra glucose it has, it's going to store as starch down here in the potatoes. So it takes this excess glucose and it links them together by covalent bonds, and it turns it into a starch molecule, and it essentially saves it for later. So potatoes have a lot of starch in them. Now, starch is what we call a complex carbohydrate. Okay, any carbohydrate that's strung together in long complex chains, like we see here, is considered a complex carbohydrate. And I want to talk about complex carbohydrates just real quickly, but from a dietary perspective, from a health perspective, the majority of our carbohydrates should come from complex carbohydrates. They should come from starches. And the reason this is the case is that foods with complex carbohydrates like breads, legumes, rice, and pasta, they tend to have other nutritional value besides carbohydrates. So they have vitamins in it, they have minerals in it, they have fiber, they have other important health benefits besides just the carbohydrates. Another thing about complex carbohydrates, and we'll talk about this quite a bit in the digestive system, is that they don't raise blood sugar levels as quickly. And I'll just go through that really quickly. But imagine you consumed a potato, and so you have all this starch going through the digestive tract. In order for this carbohydrate to move from the digestive tract into the blood, the digestive tract has to cleave off individual glucose units. And this through enzymes. There's enzymes that do that. And so in order for this carbohydrate to move from the digestive tract into the blood, you have to cleave off individual glucose units, and then they get shipped off into the blood. And that just takes time to do it. And so you have this slow release of glucose into the blood, and therefore you have a slow increase in blood sugar levels, which is nice for your pancreas because the pancreas doesn't have to release all this insulin all at once. But again, we'll get back to that in the digestive system. Now, besides starch and complex carbohydrates, we also receive dietary carbohydrates in the form of what we call simple carbohydrates. So complex carbohydrates are long chains of carbohydrates, but simple carbohydrates, which are often called sugars, are simply monosaccharides and disaccharides. So they're not long complex chains. They're either individual sugars or two sugars linked together. And let's look at some of those. Here's some disaccharides that we can find in the diet. Sucrose, which is table sugar, is a glucose and a fructose unit. Here's lactose, which we find in milk. And then maltose is another disaccharide. So those are some disaccharides. We already talked about the monosaccharides here: glucose, fructose, and galactose. So these are all considered sugars. And we do find sugars in fruits and vegetables, particularly in fruits like apples and oranges. And so you are going to get some of your dietary carbohydrates through sugars. But again, it's nice to consume these sugars in non-processed foods. And the reason that's the case is because when you're eating this apple, not only are you getting carbohydrates in the form of sugars, but there's also other health benefits to it. There's vitamins, there's minerals, there's fiber in it. And so it's good to obtain your sugars, your mono and your disaccharides, through naturally occurring foods. As opposed to, say, getting them from soft drinks like Coca-Cola. If we look at the ingredients here, one of the primary ingredients is high fructose corn syrup. And so it has super concentrated fructose in it, super concentrated monosaccharides. And there's a couple reasons why this is not necessarily good. One of those is that, sure, you're getting your carbohydrates, but you're not getting any other nutritional benefit. You're not getting any proteins. You're not getting any fiber or vitamins and minerals from this Coca-Cola. And so we call those empty calories, because you're getting carbohydrates and it's filling you up, but you're not getting any other nutritional value from it. The other problem with something like this is that it can cause big spikes in blood sugar. And so when this fructose is traveling down the digestive tract, it can be directly absorbed into the blood. And so you have all this fructose that enters the small intestine, and it all gets absorbed at once, and you get this big spike in blood sugar. And that causes your pancreas to release a whole bunch of insulin all at once, which is not ideal. So there are two other polysaccharides that consist entirely of glucose that I want to talk about besides starch. And one of those is glycogen. And glycogen is a highly branched polymer of glucose. So this is the structure of glycogen. You can see that there's a lot of branching going on. But again, each of these individual units is an individual glucose unit. And glycogen is how animals store excess glucose. It's how humans store excess glucose. And one of the places that it does this is in the liver. And this is going to be really important for moderating blood sugar levels. So here we have our normal blood sugar levels. And after a meal, your blood sugar goes up. And eventually it's going to get to levels that are above where we want them. We have too much glucose in the blood. Well, what are we going to do with that glucose? That's an important energy source, and we just don't want to get rid of it. That's where the liver comes into play. So the liver takes this excess glucose, it links it together into, sorry, let me say that again. So we have this excess glucose. This glucose is taken up by the liver, and the liver links those individual glucose units together, and it makes glycogen. So now we have glycogen that's stored in the liver. And by doing so, it's taking that glucose out of the blood, and so your blood sugar goes back down, it falls back down into normal range. And so it brings blood sugar back down where it needs to be, and now we've also stored this glucose as glycogen for later. Because then inevitably there's going to be times where you haven't eaten in a while. Change colors here. And your blood sugar is going to fall below levels that it needs to be. So what do you do now? If you're not consuming any food, you need to get your blood sugar up somehow. Well, in that case, what the liver does is the liver takes this glycogen, it cleaves off individual glucose units, and it sends that glucose back into the blood. And so it takes the glycogen, breaks it down into individual glucose, sends the glucose back into the blood, and it brings blood sugar levels back up to where they need to be. So the liver and the storage of glycogen is super important for maintaining normal blood sugar levels. Another place that glycogen is stored in the body is within skeletal muscle cells. And the reason glycogen is stored in skeletal muscle cells, however, is a little bit different. It's mainly there to be used for the skeletal muscles themselves. So here's a skeletal muscle cell, and you can't see this, but within the skeletal muscle cells, there are granules that contain glycogen in them. And basically, this is a little personal energy source for each of the skeletal muscle cells. When during exercise, when you're using, when there's a lot of ATP being required for contraction, then this glycogen is broken down into glucose, and the glucose enters cellular respiration within the skeletal muscle cell, and it's used to generate ATP. And so it's a little direct source of energy that the skeletal muscle cells can use. Now, I need to point out that from a dietary perspective, glycogen provides an insignificant amount of dietary glucose. So we do not get our carbohydrates from glycogen. If you eat a steak, even though that steak, those skeletal muscle cells have little glycogen granules in it, it's an insignificant amount. You're not getting a significant amount of carbohydrates from the glycogen in the skeletal muscle cells. On that same note, you'd have to eat a lot of chicken liver to get a nutritionally significant amount of carbohydrates from the glycogen in the liver there. So it's not a significant source of glucose. Okay, that's where starch comes into play. And the other polysaccharide consisting entirely of glucose is cellulose. And this is cellulose here. Each of these individual units is a glucose unit, but you can see that there's no branching going on. You have these parallel strands of glucose units, and that represents cellulose. Now, cellulose is found in plants, and they're excellent structural molecules in plants. They give plants structure, they give them rigidity, and celery is a good example of that. In fact, you can see the cellulose running up through here, giving this celery its rigidity. And if you bite into that celery and you get those strings caught in between your teeth, that's cellulose that you're getting caught there. Now, cellulose is a type of dietary fiber. And dietary fiber is consumable but indigestible plant material. That means that we can eat it, but we cannot break it down and absorb it into the blood. Okay, so we can consume it, but we are not able to break off these individual glucose units and ship them into the blood. We just don't have the enzymes to do that. You have to be a ruminant like a cow or a goat with an extra chamber in the stomach to be able to do that. So because it's indigestible, there is no nutritional value from it. We're not getting any nutritional value from cellulose, but it does have health benefits associated with it. And there's two types of dietary fiber, and cellulose is one of those. It's what we call insoluble fiber. And an insoluble fiber means that it does not dissolve in water. And so as it passes down the digestive tract, it's not absorbing, it's not dissolving in water. And so insoluble fiber passes through the GI tract, the gastrointestinal tract, largely intact. And what it does is it increases the bulk of the stool and it facilitates defecation. And so there is health advantages to that, to increasing the bulk of the stool and actually helping you defecate. The other type of fiber is called soluble fiber, and pectin is an example of that. This is the structure of pectin. It's a little more complicated. You have this galactouronic acid backbone, and then you have all these different sugars that come off of that. And you can find pectin in fruits, especially citrus fruits have pectin in it. But anyways, pectin is a soluble fiber. And what that means is that it mixes with water. And so as soluble fiber like pectin is traveling down the digestive tract, it absorbs water and it swells. It forms a gel-like substance. And this has the benefit of moderating blood sugar levels. Okay? It slows the digestion and absorption of carbohydrates, and so you get a slower increase in blood sugar. It moderates blood sugar levels. Instead of having those big spikes, you have a slower absorption of sugar into the bloodstream. Soluble fiber is also fermented into the colon into gases and physiologically active byproducts, and some of these can reduce blood cholesterol levels. So soluble fiber can reduce blood cholesterol levels. And another thing about soluble fiber is it causes an extended feeling of fullness, and this can help in maintaining a healthy weight. So we've talked quite a bit about carbohydrates now, and so now I want to bring that all together to see if we can recognize these different types of carbohydrates in a nutritional label. And specifically, this is a nutritional label for a bunch of carrots. And out of this bunch of carrots, we have 7 grams of total carbohydrates. And what I want you guys to do is to determine how many of those grams are distributed between the different types of carbohydrates that we talked about. How many of those grams represent dietary fiber? How many of those grams represent simple sugars? How much of that represents glycogen? And how much of that represents starch? Now, they've given you some of those answers. All right, they tell you that 2 of those grams are dietary fiber. And they tell you that 3 of those grams are from simple sugars, naturally occurring mono and disaccharides. But that leaves us with 2 grams remaining. And so where do those 2 grams go? And that's what I want you guys to determine. Does that 2 grams, does it represent glycogen? Does it represent starch? Or is it maybe a little of both? And what I want you to do is to think about where we find glycogen and where we find starch. Do we find glycogen in plants? Do we find starch in plants? Okay, and that should help you to answer those questions. Where do we find glycogen? Where do we find starch? So that brings us to the next nutrient we're going to talk about, which are proteins. And just like carbohydrates, proteins are polymers. They're molecules that are made up of many individual units. But now the individual units that are going to make up proteins are amino acids. So if this represents a protein in its linear structure, the individual units that are going to make up a protein are amino acids. These are all individual amino acids that are covalently bound together. And there are 20 amino acids that are required by the body for proper functioning. And these are those 20 amino acids there. Things like alanine, glycine, isoleucine. And we can divide these amino acids up into 2 different categories. And one of those is non-essential amino acids. Non-essential amino acids are those amino acids that can be synthesized by the body. So the body can make those. And in this chart here, the non-essential amino acids have a solid circle around them. So like proline, glutamic acid, arginine, these are all amino acids that the body can make. And then the other category are essential amino acids. And essential amino acids, they're represented by these dashed circles here, like valine. Essential amino acids cannot be made by the body. So the body needs them, but it cannot make them. And so if the body cannot make them, where do we have to get our essential amino acids? We have to get them from the diet. Now, animal-based proteins such as meats, eggs, and milk, these are all what we call complete proteins. And that means that they meet all of the body's amino acid requirements. They have all 20 amino acids in them, including all of the essential amino acids. And then from a plant perspective, soybeans are also a complete protein. They also have all of the amino acids in them. But if you're a vegetarian, then it is possible to receive all of those amino acids. You just have to be a little more strategic about it. And that's because most plants do not contain all of the essential amino acids. And so you have to consume a combination of plant-based foods to meet these essential amino acid requirements. Now, why are proteins and amino acids required in the diet? Well, one of the reasons is that we can use amino acids, proteins and amino acids, to generate ATP. They can be used to enter cellular respiration and be used to generate ATP, but they're not a preferred source. We'd rather not do this. So the main reason that we need amino acids in the diet is to synthesize new proteins. There's a lot of structures in the body that are made from proteins. Antibodies, enzymes. There's a whole classification of hormones called protein hormones or peptide hormones, and insulin is one of those. Proteins are a major component of muscle, skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. And so you need proteins in the diet to be able to make all of these different structures so the body is able to function properly. And the last thing I want to point out for this, is how does the body do this? How does the body make new proteins? How does it make antibodies, make enzymes? And that's where we go to the level of the cell. Here we have the cell. This is the nucleus, and within the nucleus, we have DNA. And what does DNA do? DNA contains the instructions to make proteins. So there's genes on the DNA, and each of those genes contains the instructions to make a protein. So when we want to make a protein, we have to go through two processes. Collectively, it's called gene expression. But the first thing that we need to do is we need to take that gene, that DNA, and we need to make an mRNA copy of it. And that's called transcription, and that occurs in the nucleus. Then that mRNA moves into the cytoplasm, and it gets incorporated with these ribosomes and these tRNAs. And basically what happens is you have these mRNA instructions, and the mRNA goes through this ribosome, and those instructions are read, and a protein is built because of that. And taking that mRNA molecule and converting it into a protein, into a polypeptide, is called translation. That brings us to our next category of nutrients and our last macronutrient, which are lipids. And there's a few different categories of lipids, but what they all have in common is their inability to mix with water. So if you were to mix a lipid with water, then they're not going to mix together. Okay, they're going to be separate. And there's a few different categories of lipids. One of those are steroids. And cholesterol is considered a type of steroid. There's a whole category of hormones called steroid hormones, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, and those are all lipids. Another category of lipids are phospholipids. And where do we find those? Where do we find phospholipids? Well, phospholipids make up the plasma membrane that surrounds the cells of the body. So they have a structural role in the plasma membrane, and they regulate what goes into and out of the cell. And then the third category of lipids, and this is the one that I want to talk about with regards to nutrition, are triglycerides. Okay, triglycerides are our nutritional lipids. These are the lipids we're going to get nutrition from. And there's two different categories. One of those are saturated fats. And saturated fats tend to be solid at room temperature, okay, like butter, for instance. And we know these, we call these saturated fats, we typically call these fats. Then the other category are unsaturated fats. And unsaturated fats tend to be liquid at room temperature. And we know these as oils. Let's take a quick look at the structure of triglycerides. So triglycerides contain 3 fatty acids and 1 glycerol. And that's what we're looking at right here. There's a glycerol head, and then there's 3 fatty acid chains that come off of it. And that's why they call the triglyceride. Tri, referring to the 3 fatty acid chains, glyceride, referring to the glycerol head. And the body can use this, the glycerol portion and the individual fatty acid chains to harness a bunch of energy from. So let's take a look briefly at each of these different types of lipids. And the first one we have here are saturated fats. And saturated fats are known more commonly just as fats. When you're talking about fats, you're talking about saturated fats. And saturated fats are derived mainly from animal sources, and they tend to be solid at room temperature. Now, the reason they're called saturated has to do with the carbons in the fatty acid chains. So these fatty acid chains are carbon-based. And if you look at each of those carbons, the reason they're called saturated is because there's 4 single bonds coming off each one of those carbons. They're saturated with single bonds. So that's why it's called a saturated fat, and that's also why these fats are solid at room temperature, because of that structure. So like I mentioned, saturated fats are derived mainly from animal sources, and you can see some of this saturated fat in this ground beef. Where do you see the saturated fat in this ground beef? All of these white little specks in there is all saturated fat. Butter is a saturated fat. And from a dietary perspective, it's recommended to limit the amount of saturated fats in your diet, just because they do raise the level of cholesterol in your blood, and that puts you at risk for heart disease and stroke, for cardiovascular disease. Then we have unsaturated fats. And unsaturated fats are known more commonly as oils. When we're talking about oils, we're talking about unsaturated fats. And unsaturated fats are derived primarily from plants, but they are also found in meats as well. And unsaturated fats tend to be liquid at room temperature. Now, the reason they're called unsaturated, again, has to do with the carbons in the fatty acid tails. And with unsaturated fats, 1 are more of these carbons in the fatty acid tails. Instead of having 4 single bonds, instead they have a double bond that's associated with them. And so that makes them unsaturated. And just that small little structural difference is what makes unsaturated fats liquid at room temperature. Here are some different examples of unsaturated fats: olive oil, avocado oil, omega-3s that we find in cold water fish are a type of unsaturated fats. And it's recommended that if possible, that you get your lipids primarily through unsaturated fats, because they do help reduce heart disease, they lower cholesterol, and they do have other health benefits associated with it. So what does the body do with triglycerides? What does it do with lipids? We ingest lipids in the diet, then what happens to them? Well, the body stores triglycerides within adipose cells located mainly beneath the skin in what we call the subcutaneous layer underneath the skin. So this is histology of adipose tissue that we can find in the subcutaneous layer. And each of these are individual adipocytes, individual adipose cells. And the reason that they don't stain is because they're filled with triglycerides. So these adipocytes are filled with triglycerides. And like I mentioned, we find adipose cells in the subcutaneous layer, but then if we have too much fat that accumulates, and it can accumulate in other places, like in the abdominal cavity, and that's where it starts to give us real problems. So what functions do triglycerides serve? Well, triglycerides are a major source of energy. They're the body's most compact and efficient form of stored energy. And so within these little adipocytes, there's a lot of potential stored energy. And you can see that these triglycerides can be broken down into glycerol and fatty acids, and both of these enter different parts of the cellular respiration process and can be used to generate ATP. So it's an energy source. We store energy this way. But also, the fact that we store these triglycerides in the subcutaneous layer, why do we do that? Well, that's providing a layer of insulation, a layer of thermal insulation, and also physical protection as well. Now we can move on to the micronutrients. And the first micronutrient I want to talk about are vitamins. And vitamins are organic compounds. That means they're carbon-based, required by organisms in minute amounts for overall functioning of the body. And in general, vitamins cannot be synthesized in sufficient amounts by the body. And so what that means is that we have to obtain vitamins through the diet. We can't synthesize them in sufficient quantities ourselves to do their jobs. We have to get them through the diet. There are some exceptions to this. Vitamin D can be made by the skin in the presence of UV light. And then also B vitamins and vitamin K can be synthesized in small amounts by bacteria in the intestine. But in general, we need to obtain vitamins through the diet. Now there's 2 categories of vitamins, and one of those categories are water-soluble vitamins. And what this means is that water-soluble vitamins have to be absorbed along with water from the gastrointestinal tract. So to move from the gastrointestinal tract into the blood, they have to be absorbed along with water. So water has to be present. And one of the things that these means is that water-soluble vitamins cannot be stored by the body. Okay, we can't store water-soluble vitamins. So any water-soluble vitamins we ingest have to be taken up by the cells in about an hour to be used, or otherwise they're going to be excreted in the urine. And the main water-soluble vitamins are the B complex vitamins and also vitamin C. And there's a whole group of B vitamins, B1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 9, and 12, but you may recognize them from their common names: thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, and then also vitamin C is a water-soluble vitamin known also as ascorbic acid. So what do these vitamins do? Well, with respect to B vitamins, most B vitamins are what we call coenzymes. They're coenzymes for key metabolic processes such as cellular respiration. So let's review some terminology here. First of all, here we have an enzyme, and an enzyme is a substance that increases the rate of a chemical reaction without becoming chemically changed itself. And so this enzyme is going to take this substrate, it's going to break a chemical bond, and it's going to turn it into these two individual products. But lots of enzymes, in order to perform their jobs, require what we call coenzymes. These are molecules required by enzymes to accomplish their particular tasks. And most of the B vitamins are coenzymes. And when we look at the process of cellular respiration, taking glucose and converting that to ATP into energy, there's hundreds of enzymes that are involved in this process. And the B vitamins are coenzymes for many of those enzymes involved in converting glucose into ATP. So here we have an advertisement for B vitamins, specifically B12, and it says that B12 supports cellular energy production in the body. Is that a true statement? That is a true statement, because B12 is a coenzyme for cellular respiration, which is cellular energy production, taking glucose and converting that to ATP. So it does support cellular energy production. The other category of vitamins are fat-soluble vitamins, and this includes vitamins A, D, E, and K. And what this means is that fat-soluble vitamins require lipids to be present to move from the gastrointestinal tract into the blood. They're absorbed along with lipids from the gastrointestinal tract into the blood. And what that means, if you have a multivitamin and your multivitamin has fat-soluble vitamins in it, then you should make sure to eat some source of lipids at the same time, because those lipids are going to be required to transport those vitamins across the intestinal wall and into the blood. Now, because these vitamins are fat-soluble, that means that they can be stored in the body. Okay, they can be stored in the fat of the body, which is good because, we can save some for later. But it also means that there can be, that excess amounts can result in toxicity. And this shows some of the potential repercussions of having excess amounts of each of these vitamins stored in the body. But, if you eat a normal, well-balanced diet, then you shouldn't have to worry about having excess, about having toxicity. So let's take a look at some of these vitamins. First of all, we have vitamin A, And vitamin A is an important component of visual pigments, okay, pigments in the eye. And they also have an important role in the maintenance of epithelial tissues like the skin. And so if you have a deficiency of vitamin A, because they're an important component of visual pigments, then it can result in blindness. And because they're involved in maintenance of the skin, a deficiency can result in skin disorders. Then we have vitamin D, and vitamin D is critical in the absorption of calcium and phosphorus from the digestive tract into the blood. It's critical for moving calcium from the GI tract into the blood. And so if you have a deficiency in this, then your blood calcium levels are going to be low. And if you have a severe deficiency, then that can result in bone deformities in children when your bones are forming. And if you have a severe vitamin D deficiency in adults, then that can result in the softening of bones because there's not enough calcium present in the blood to help form the matrix of the bone. Vitamin E. Vitamin D is an antioxidant and it helps prevent damage to cell membranes. And then vitamin K, which you can find in green vegetables, has an important role in blood clotting. All right, and now we move on to minerals, which are the other type of micronutrient. And minerals are naturally occurring substances. They have a chemical formula. They're usually solid and inorganic. That means they're non-carbon based, and they typically have a crystal structure. And so minerals come from the earth. These are things that are derived from the earth that somehow we need to get into our body for our body to be able to function. And minerals are a micronutrient, meaning they're required in trace amounts, just minute amounts to ensure a smooth functioning body. And let's take a look at some of these minerals, or at least the form that they come from the earth. Here we have azurite. What mineral do we need that comes from azurite? Copper. Here's a pile of phosphorus. This yellow crystal structure here is sulfur. The crystal structure we're looking at right there is what we call halite or rock salt, and that has both sodium and chloride in it, two minerals that the body needs. What about dolomite? Dolomite has a couple different minerals in it. One, it has calcium, and that's what's contributing to this the white coloration of it. And there's also magnesium present in dolomite. Let's take a look at some of these minerals now and find out why they're important for the body. And let's start with calcium. Well, calcium has a lot of different roles in the body. It's important for bone and tooth formation, blood clotting, and nerve and muscle function are all dependent on calcium. If you remember from the nervous system, for neurons to release neurotransmitters across synaptic clefts, calcium has to flood into that presynaptic neuron. And also for skeletal muscle contraction to occur, calcium has to be released by the sarcoplasmic reticulum within the cell for that skeletal muscle contraction to occur. Phosphorus is also important for bone and tooth formation. Sulfur is a component of certain amino acids, so you need sulfur to build specific amino acids. Potassium is also involved in nerve function. And then we're going to talk a lot about sodium in this class. Sodium plays a critical role in water balance because wherever sodium goes in the body, water is going to go along with it. And the endocrine system and the urinary system are going to be involved in regulating the amount of sodium that we find in the blood. So sodium plays a role in water balance and therefore blood pressure. And it also plays a critical role in the nervous system, setting resting membrane potentials and allowing neurons to generate action potentials. Iron, we talked about iron before. Iron's a component of hemoglobin, and it allows hemoglobin to carry oxygen. So it's important in red blood cells being able to distribute oxygen throughout the body. And iodine is a component of thyroid hormone. And the thyroid gland is located on the anterior side of the neck, right below the larynx. And iodine is required for that to occur. And if you don't have iodine in the diet, then the thyroid gland is not able to produce thyroid hormone. So what happens, if you're not producing thyroid hormone, you get this stimulation from the brain that tells the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone, but it can't do it because it doesn't have iodine. But this stimulation of the thyroid gland causes it to grow and causes it to form this goiter. And an easy way around that, there's a lot of developing countries that don't have iodine in the soil, and so their foods don't have iodine in it. And so you can get these goiters. But what they did is they just fortified salt with iodine. They iodized the salt, and that's a really slick way, easy way for people to get iodine in their diet. And the last thing I want to do is take all this nutritional information that we've learned and apply it to some actual foods. And this is part of your nutrition label assignment, but I'll go ahead and get you guys going on it right now, and then we'll review it later. So the first thing that I want you to do is match each of these nutritional labels with each of these foods. So we have Dave's Good Seed Bread, we have this highly marbled steak, and we have a can of Mountain Dew. And so I want you to match each of these foods with the appropriate nutritional label. The next thing I want you to do after you do that is to take a look at the different macronutrients and micronutrients that are present in each one of those foods. And specifically, I'd like you guys to tell me where within those foods we find each of these nutrients, especially for the macronutrients. So for instance, if we look at this nutritional label right here, we can see that there's fat in it. There's 3 grams of fat, and there's no saturated fat, which means that there's unsaturated fat in there. Well, where within the food specifically are you finding that fat? Then we go down here to carbohydrates. There's 25 grams of carbohydrates, and there's fiber, there's simple sugars, and there's also starch. So where specifically within that food are you finding these carbohydrates? What ingredients from that food actually have carbohydrates in them? And then you can also see that this particular food has protein in it. So where within the food are you specifically finding protein? And lastly, what I'd like you to do is to tell me which of these foods represents what we call empty calories. First of all, what are empty calories? And we talked about that earlier. Empty calories are from foods that fill you up but don't give you a lot of nutritional value. So those are what empty calories are, and I want you to tell me which of these foods represents empty calories and why that's the case. Okay, sounds good.